Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Podbean, Spotify, and other platforms, and if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So this will be the third part in my series on the Impossible City, the history of Venice. And I left off the second part by briefly describing the end of the Venetian Republic and the takeover and eventual refashioning of the city by Napoleonic France. But just to go back again to just before that pivotal moment, we saw how in the 18th century, with the loss of the empire and the decline of commerce, the economy of Venice transitioned to tourism and the pleasure industries, including theater, music, opera, sex, and gambling, all culminating each winter in the famous Carnevale. In the 1790s, during the French Revolutionary Wars, the Republic of Venice was caught up in the crossfire of warfare between France and Austria. In 1796, French forces under the General Napoleon captured Milan from the Austrians and then continued on to lay siege to the last Austrian stronghold in Italy, which was Mantova, very close to the borders of Venetian territory. The Venetians tried to remain neutral, but they did allow Austria to march troops through their territory to try to break the French siege of Mantova. Napoleon saw this as a hostile act. He turned on Venice with great animus and seized the city of Verona, Venice's most important stronghold on the mainland. In February 1797, Mantova finally fell to Napoleon. The Austrians fled back across the Alps, and the French now controlled most of northern Italy. But many towns, including Verona, continued to resist and rebel against the French occupiers. Former subjects of Venice rallied to the banner of St. Mark and called for a return to Venetian rule. Napoleon, for his part, believed that the Venetians were behind this, orchestrating this wave of resistance, and it further enraged him against Venice. In the early spring of 1797, Napoleon worked out a provisional peace with Austria, according to which France laid claim to all of what had been Austrian territory in Italy and all of Venice's mainland territories, the so-called terra firma. And Venice was left with only the lagoon islands around the city itself. In April 1797, after a small skirmish at sea between French and Venetian boats near the Lido, Napoleon sent a fleet of gunboats into the lagoon and placed cannons within range to bombard the city. On May 3rd, he wrote back to Paris, quote, "I see nothing that can be done except to obliterate the Venetian name from the face of the globe." There was confusion and chaos in the city, with many nobles fearing that with the French occupation, a guillotine might be erected in the piazza. Around half of them fled to their mainland estates or abroad. Meanwhile, the commoners in the city were divided. On the one hand, the Arsenale workers rallied, demanding that the city should not surrender without a fight, while many middle-class intellectuals in the coffee houses and elsewhere wished to welcome Napoleon and the French as harbingers of reform and modernization. On May 9th, Napoleon's secretary delivered an ultimatum to the Grand Council in Venice, demanding that they must abolish the Republic and hand over control of the city to the French forces or face attack. On May 12th, the Grand Council convened and capitulated, proclaiming the Republic over in return for the safety of the Venetians' lives, property, and religion. The French sent in 3,000 troops to occupy the city and seized the Doge's palace and other civic buildings. So under French domination, the city was placed under a new so-called municipality government, staffed mainly by Venetians but under French suzerainty. And it included a council of 60, mainly comprising liberal reformists and former Jacobin sympathizers. The ghetto was abolished and religious freedom proclaimed. Celebrations were held around a liberty tree in the piazza. Most Venetians stayed away from these celebrations, but those who openly opposed or mocked the festivities were jailed. And all in all, the fall of the Republic can be seen as a sort of odd hybrid event, part revolution and part conquest. And it was sealed by acts of iconoclasm, the destruction of images and statues of the Lion of St. Mark, the burning of the Doge's robes and the Golden Book. The Carnival and the Sensa festivals were abolished, and revolutionaries and collaborators in Venice hoped that the city would be reborn as a democracy and perhaps lead a broader popular revolution in Italy. But the rug was pulled out from under them when, in October 1797, Napoleon concluded the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria, which transferred all of Venetian territory, including the city itself, into Austrian control. And this suddenly thrust the city into the hands of the most reactionary and autocratic monarchy in Western Europe. French sympathizers were shocked and humiliated, and many fled. In December 1797, French troops began to withdraw from the city, and as they did so, Napoleon ordered a wave of despoliation. Monumental artworks and treasures were seized and shipped back to Paris, including the 4 horses of San Marco, which were taken from the facade of the basilica, sent to France and placed atop a triumphal arch, and Veronese's monumental oil painting, The Wedding Feast at Cana, which occupies one wall of the refectory of the monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore, was also removed, rolled up, and sent to France. The winged lion of St. Mark was taken down from atop the column in front of the Doge's palace. The Arsenale was shut down, the materials stripped out down to the bare walls, and soldiers took up axes and destroyed the Bucintoro, the Doge's gilded state barge, built for the annual marriage to the sea ceremony. Now, as it happens years later, after the fall of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, the bronze horses would be given back and were placed in the basilica. But other works remained in Paris, such as Veronese's Wedding Feast at Cana, which is still to this day in the Louvre Museum. In January 1798, an Austrian general took possession of Venice, and this time many more liberals and Jacobins fled, following in another wave after the patricians who had fled from the French. The Austrians in some ways reversed some changes. They reinstated the Venetian legal code and installed patricians into the governing council. But all external affairs were still managed by Vienna. Venetian tourism had basically died with these repeated wars in the Napoleonic period, and the council wished to revive the city's trade in order to revive the economy, and they requested to the Austrians for Dalmatia and Trieste to be placed under Venetian control in order to gain back a role in Adriatic trade, but they were refused. So the city basically languished, becoming a backwater. Some foreigners, especially English, came to see Venice as a sort of tragic figure, rather like a fallen woman. In 1802, the famous English romantic poet William Wordsworth published a poem which compares the city to a maiden who now has fallen from glory, saying, quote, "She was a maiden city, bright and free, no guile seduced, no force could violate. And when she took unto herself a mate, she must espouse the everlasting sea." So this, evokes and draws right upon that Venetian tradition of the marriage to the sea. And what if she had seen those glories fade, those titles vanish, and that strength decay? Yet shall some tribute of regret be paid when her long life hath reached its final day. Men are we, and must grieve when even the shade of that which once was great is passed away. But by this time, Venice had so much fame and history behind it, there was no way it would simply fade into obscurity. It was already too important as a symbol and a spectacle, even without its trading empire. In December 1805, Napoleon defeated the Austrians decisively at the Battle of Austerlitz, and in the Treaty of Pressburg, Austria ceded back to France all of its territories in Italy, including Venice and the Veneto. And in January 1806, the Austrians handed the city back to the French. And now when the French came in, there were no paeans to liberty or democracy. The political climate had changed. Liberals in the city had already fled long ago, and as for Napoleon, he had now seized rulership in France and declared himself emperor. So there was no pretense to democratic republican ideals here. And it was clear that the city would be governed in an authoritarian manner. It was incorporated into a new so-called Kingdom of Italy, basically comprising northern Italy, under Napoleon as titular monarch and with its capital at Milan. and Napoleon intended to use Venice as a naval base for operations in the Mediterranean. He appointed his stepson Eugène de Beauharnais as viceroy, with titles including Prince of Venice, and the prince himself took up residence first in the Doge's palace and then in the larger Procuratie Nuove on the southern side of the Piazza San Marco. So Napoleon, at this point, was no longer, as we saw, a Republican revolutionary. He was an emperor, but he did have one real reforming mission, which was curtailing the power of the church. He ordered the closures of over 50 religious houses and hundreds of scuole or lay confraternities. He consolidated over 100 parishes in the city to only 34, closing dozens of churches. He converted church and monastic buildings to secular uses, such as gymnasia, hospitals, and prisons, and he confiscated more religious artworks, many of them being sent back to Milan or to France. In 1807, Napoleon visited Venice in person, and he was welcomed by a floating triumphal arch at the northern entrance to the Grand Canal. He was feted with balls, banquets, and a regatta on the water. He viewed an opera at La Fenice, and the theater took over several family boxes in the gallery in order to consolidate them into a single large and lavish imperial box for Napoleon. But the emperor himself found the city to be too cramped and disorderly. He ordered that it be remade on the new Parisian model, with wide open spaces connected by broad avenues in geometric form. And they concentrated first on the eastern end of the city. The shore embankment running from San Marco eastward to Castello, called the Riva degli Scavoni, was massively widened into a broad riverfront avenue, reminiscent of those along the Seine in Paris. The main street in Castello, in the eastern end of the city, was also massively enlarged and called the Via Eugenia, after the viceroy. And at the far eastern end of Castello, a largely poor, slum-like neighborhood, housing many fishermen and dock workers, called Motta di Sant'Antonio, was demolished and turned into public gardens. Similarly, the fish markets and grain warehouses along the lagoon shore directly south of the Piazza San Marco were demolished and made into private royal gardens. And finally, the Renaissance church of San Gimignano, designed by Sansovino on the western end of the Piazza San Marco, was demolished to make way for an extension and grand entranceway to the royal palace. And all of this was aimed in a way into making Venice into a kind of sub-capital, a kind of provincial capital of a new, modern, neo-Roman empire, a sort of little Paris on the water. But this project was short-lived. In 1812, Napoleon began his disastrous invasion of Russia, which destroyed his main army. Napoleon's enemies marched into France and seized its territories. In April 1814, even before the Congress of Vienna had opened, Austrians marched again into Venice. And they adopted a policy basically of restoration. For example, returning the four horses from France to the Basilica San Marco and the winged lion to its perch on the top of the column in the Piazzetta. And with the peace after the fall of Napoleon, there was some return of tourism to Venice, but much diminished. The gambling parlors and brothels had been closed, the great festivals were over, and much of the population had fled or emigrated, and it had diminished to fewer than 100,000, apparently the smallest the city had been since the 1400s. Many nobles were impoverished with the collapse of trade, and they began to instead host English visitors or even to rent out their palazzi on the cheap to foreign tourists. And it seems that many visitors found the city rather gloomy, with its closed markets and decaying Gothic buildings. It had an air of tragedy, which might be off-putting to some, but also remarkably fortunate in a way. This was serendipitous, that in the early 19th century, gloomy atmospheres were much in demand, and decaying Gothic buildings were now in vogue. Among the first English expatriates to spend an extended time in Venice was George Lord Byron, who became the great celebrity of the early 19th century. He was an attractive and controversial English writer and adventurer, in many ways evocative of Casanova before him, but more mysterious, known for sexual scandals and for explorations and escapades in the East. He became an inspiration for the literary fashion for vampire romances, pirate dramas, and later figures like Indiana Jones. In 1816, Byron was basically forced out of English high society, and he took up a palazzo in Venice and lived there for 3 years. And among the reasons why he went to Venice was that he loved the sea. He was a champion long-distance swimmer. He often swam across the lagoon to the Lido to visit the Jewish cemetery there and to ride horses on the beaches and dunes, sometimes together with his friend Percy Bysshe Shelley. He also challenged an Italian rival to a swimming race from the Lido back to the city and up the Grand Canal, which he won in a bit less than 4 hours. He also enjoyed Italian music and went to operas at La Fenice, which was open once again. But maybe most of all, Byron loved the romantically ramshackle cityscapes. And he wrote back to his publisher in England, quote, "I like the gloomy gaiety of their gondolas and the silence of their canals. I do not even dislike the evident decay of the city, though I regret the singularity of its vanished costume." Byron took inspiration from Venice for literary works, including 2 plays about Venetian doges. And his work tended to emphasize in classic Gothic fashion the supposed oppression and tyranny of the Venetian state. It was Byron who coined the name Bridge of Sighs for the Baroque-covered bridge connecting the Doge's palace to the state prisons, imagining scenes of condemned prisoners being led across the bridge and stealing last glimpses of the canals. It was a sort of perfect scene of a romantic combination of beauty and horror. In 1819, though, Byron followed his mistress, a married Italian lady, out of Venice, and he spent the last few years of his life advocating for independence and unity for Italy, and then for Greece. And he became part, in a way, of a national republican movement called the Risorgimento, or Resurgence, which was gaining traction in much of Italy, but which came relatively late to Venice. In the 1820s, Romanticism and the Gothic Revival continued to rise in popularity across Europe, especially among the growing middle classes, which were gaining wealth from industrialization. And you can see this Romanticism of the past and the Gothic in a way as a response to the sort of sterility and mass production of the industrial city. And in Venice, they were drawn to the spectacle of poverty and decline amidst opulent but decaying urban fabrics. The city was seen almost like an aging painted lady with a tragic backstory, unable to break from its past. You could think of it as almost a Miss Havisham of Europe. And opera in this period also had something of a revival, with works by Rossini, Donizetti, and Bellini in the new, more florid and expressive Romantic style, debuting at La Fenice and other smaller theaters around Venice. Tourism continued to grow, with increasing numbers of middle-class visitors from Northern Europe. Several palazzi eventually were converted into hotels, starting in 1822, when the 14th century Palazzo Dandolo, once belonging to one of the eminent patrician families of Venice, in Castello, being reopened as the Hotel Danieli. Artists and writers went in significant numbers. The city became a sort of refuge for controversial bohemians, like the novelist George Sand, who lived there with her lover in 1834-5. And also it became a destination for lovers of architecture. It was the perfect place for romantic tastes, which preferred the atmosphere and fine detailings of the Gothic. And specifically, the English critic John Ruskin first visited Venice in 1835 as a teenager and was captivated. He later went on to write his multi-volume opus, The Stones of Venice, celebrating the craftsmanship and human-scaled detailing of the Venetian Gothic. But the new middle-class tourists did not spend as much as the gentlemen and aristocrats of the Grand Tour back in the 1700s. The new tourist trade was not enough to revive the city to its former prosperity. And in the 1830s, the Austrian government tried to modernize the city and to rebuild something of a mercantile economy. They built new wharves and warehouses, they granted the city the status of a free port, and they ran the first gas lines into the city to light the first gas street lamps. And these efforts at modernization began to lead to a divide as to whether to remake the city to facilitate new trade and industry, or to preserve the historic fabric and cityscape that gave the city its special appeal. And this was not only an aesthetic question, but also one of economic strategy. And the great controversy that embroiled the city in the 1840s was over the idea of building a rail bridge. So the railroad was the great new means of transport and trade and travel that was sweeping through Europe. And Austria put a good deal of effort into developing a rail system. But after the idea was floated of running a rail bridge to Venice, it gained some enthusiastic supporters who came to be called pontisti, from ponte for bridge. And the pontisti wanted the rails to be built from the mainland over the lagoon to the Giudecca, the long curving island just south of the city, and then across the channel straight into the Piazzetta San Marco to bring passengers directly into the traditional ceremonial center of the city. And they argued that this would, quote, bring blood into the heart of Venice. But the opponents, who were called the anti-pontisti, believed that this would bring noise and smoke and mar the historic scenery. And symbolically, they saw it as a slap in the face to the traditional identity of Venice as being wedded to the sea. And you can see this as an early and dramatic instance of the recurring divide between modernizers and preservationists. And ultimately, the Austrian government made a compromise plan by which a bridge would be built from Mestre, a small port on the mainland, to a terminal near the northern mouth of the Grand Canal in Santa Croce, basically in the northwestern corner of the city, more or less you could say the back door of the city. And this bridge was completed and trains began running in 1846. So after 1846, tourism continued to grow and visitors started to surpass 100,000 a year, about equal to the number of residents of the city. Many of these were more middle class, coming with guidebooks in hand, wanting to see the sights and buy cheap souvenirs. And for instance, Murano glassmaking revived, making inexpensive tchotchkes for the foreign tourists. The railroads also facilitated contact with other parts of Italy and of Europe, and the city more and more was affected by the spirit of the age, including the Italian Risorgimento. There was a new rise, for one thing, of liberal reformism, but yoked to nationalism. And there was some stirring of revolutionary ideas in the city, such as the idea of striking for independence from Austria or trying to join in with other Italian states into a new Italian nation-state. Some reformists who were more moderate also called for autonomy for Venice within the Habsburg Empire, and basically the creation of a small Venetian city-state answerable only to the emperor. And this is similar to a lot of ideas and movements around the Austrian Empire, where sort of local ethno-national groups called for autonomy under the Habsburg umbrella. The main spokesperson for this reformist group was Daniele Manin. And in January 1848, Manin presented to the governing council a petition requesting home rule for Venice. But he was arrested for treason and jailed. And this movement was basically quelled for a short time until just 2 months later, in March 1848, news came that Vienna itself had erupted in riots and protests, and that the Habsburg emperor had fled. And in response to this, crowds formed in the Piazza San Marco in Venice. They stormed the prisons, broke in, and freed Manin. They then formed a provisional government under Manin's leadership and seized control of the Arsenale and proclaimed the restoration of the Republic of St. Mark. Over the course of the summer of 1848, the imperial government regained control of the capital at Vienna. And they then sent in troops to reoccupy Lombardy and the Veneto. But they could not easily seize Venice because they didn't have the right watercraft to land in the city. So they instead set up a blockade around the lagoon and besieged the city. Manin then assembled a civil guard and resolved to resist Austria at all costs. In 1849, the city continued to hold out long after the revolutions in Austria and Hungary had been quelled. But by the late winter of that year, they were starting to run out of food, and in May, Austrian ships began to bombard the city directly. In August, a cholera outbreak hit the city and thousands died, and on August 18th, emissaries from the Republic rode to the mainland and offered their surrender. Manin and other leaders fled or went into exile, but otherwise the people and the city were spared. After 1849, tourism again began to come into the city, including many British Victorians. And among them was John Ruskin, whom I mentioned earlier, who returned now as an adult to document the city's architecture, including with the new medium of photography. And in the early 1850s, specifically in 1851 and 53, he published the 2 volumes of The Stones of Venice, in which he used the city as an exemplar of Gothic building and design with its rich vernacular craftsmanship, and specifically opposed it to the Renaissance style, which had been considered to be superior among highbrow critics for centuries, but which Ruskin argued was sterile and generic. And he basically turned the accepted principles of aesthetics on their head, making Venice into a mecca for art and architecture in a totally new way, celebrating the obscure corners and details of the old city, rather than the grand Renaissance and Baroque monuments. And the books were also polemical in the sense that they were preservationist. Ruskin argued against restorations that changed or clashed with the historic cityscape. And this further changed how Venice was seen in the world. It came to be perceived as a sort of special treasure and a possession that belonged not just to the owners and residents in the city, but in a sense to the whole world. It was a sort of relic, a treasure house, an archaeological site. And foreigners, especially British Victorians, started to organize and raise money to preserve Venice in the manner that they saw fit. And this culminated in 1865 with the formation of the so-called St. Mark's Committee of the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Buildings. And with international money and influence, preservationism took a decisive upper hand over modernism. And also at the same time, in the aftermath of the failed revolution, opera had a kind of new golden age in the mid-1800s, and it could be even more dynamic and innovative as a medium than it had been in earlier years. And the new major figure of Italian opera was Giuseppe Verdi, who was a modern composer seen as a symbol of the new Italy and the Risorgimento. And in the same years that the 2 volumes of The Stones of Venice were published, Verdi's 2 most famous and successful operas premiered at La Fenice. Firstly, Rigoletto in 1851, and then La Traviata in 1853. And the title La Traviata means roughly the wayward woman or the fallen woman, and it was based on a French novel by Alexandre Dumas, which takes place in Paris and centers on a courtesan who hosts balls and salons paid for by her rich patrons, with the implication that she provides sexual favors in return for this patronage. But she then falls in love and decides to leave behind her luxurious life and career as a courtesan and to try to remake herself as a married lady. But this is a struggle in 19th century Europe. Verdi wrote much of the score in Venice on a commission from La Fenice, and I think that the opera can be seen in many ways as a metaphor for the city itself, which had been famous for high-end brothels and courtesans in the earlier Baroque age, but which was now searching for a way to remake itself and find a dignified role in the modern world. And I don't think I'm going too much out on a limb in this interpretation, since it was customary at the time for Italian reformists and revolutionaries to find political symbolism and subtext in Verdi's works, which had to be carefully adapted to get past the censors. And there were censors at La Fenice limiting what La Traviata was allowed to convey in terms of its language, its style, and its setting. But Verdi's works and opera more generally really helped to keep revolutionary nationalism alive in Italy in these years after the failure of 1848. In 1861, most northern Italian states joined together with the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia and with the revolutionary forces of Garibaldi, who had conquered the south, to form the new unified Kingdom of Italy. And the only cities left that were not under the control of this new Italian state were Rome, which was still under the governance of the Pope, and Venice, which was still controlled by Austria. And so the following 5 years in Venice were tense and restive, with the arrests of dissidents and a campaign of bombings and sabotage against the Austrian state. But in 1866, France went to war with Austria in alliance with the new Kingdom of Italy. And as part of the peace treaty at the end of this war, the French demanded that Austria transfer Venice to Italy. And the city was handed over in October 1866. In the following month, in November 1866, the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel, visited Venice and was welcomed with great pomp and celebration. So by this time, he was not seen as a foreigner, although he'd come from a very different part of Italy with a different dialect, different history. He was not seen as a foreigner, and this shows how the identity of Venetians had changed, and more they saw themselves as Italians. So the unification of Italy combined with the railroads made visiting Venice even easier, and there was a new influx again of middle-class tourists, including for the first time a lot of Americans. And it happens that the annexation of Venice into Italy came right on the heels of the end of the U.S. Civil War. So many Americans could now travel safely for the first time. Many of them, like the English, saw Venice as a sort of forebear for themselves, especially since, unlike Britain, the United States was an actual republic. Like the English, they were practical and thrifty, but arguably even more so. And American observers were struck, for one thing, by the uncleanliness and poverty of the city. The novelist Henry James wrote that, quote, "poverty is part of the spectacle." They also noted the large numbers and often rudeness and callousness of the tourists, and Henry James described, quote, "the horde of savage Germans encamped in the piazza who treat the place as an orifice in a peep show." So again, there's this sort of sexual subtext to the voyeurism of viewing Venice. But the American perception of Venice was shaped perhaps most of all by the great popular writer of the age, Mark Twain, who went to Venice in 1867. And he was amazed how a once rich and powerful city had sunk to selling toys and trinkets. For his part, he was not terribly impressed with the art and architecture. He remarked that all of these figures of saints and martyrs start to look the same. But his most powerful impressions came from a gondola ride. He described the gondola itself as, quote, "an inky, rusty old canoe," and the gondolier as, quote, "a mangy, barefooted gutter snipe." He hated the gondolier's singing, which he called caterwauling, but he watched with fascination how the gondolier conducted and maneuvered the boat through the complex waterways of the city. And Mark Twain himself was an old boatman. He had piloted riverboats on the Mississippi in his youth, and that's where he got his pen name from. Mark Twain is a measure of river depth. And Twain was amazed by the gondolier's skill. And he remarked, quote, "how in the world he can back and fill, shoot straight ahead, or flirt suddenly around a corner and make the oar stay in those insignificant notches is a problem to me and a never diminishing matter of interest. I'm afraid I study the gondolier's marvelous skill more than I do the sculptured palaces we glide among. He cuts a corner so closely now and then, or misses another gondola by such an imperceptible hairbreadth that I feel myself scrooching, as the children say, just as one does when a buggy wheel grazes his elbow. But he makes all his calculations with the nicest precision, and goes darting in and out among a Broadway confusion of busy craft with the easy confidence of the educated hackman. He never makes a mistake." End quote. So I think you could see this sort of passage as typical Mark Twain, where he casts his gaze downward and sees what is extraordinary in the ordinary man. And I think here he sets up a distinctly American way of viewing and appreciating Venice. Perhaps partly as a result of Twain, gondolas became the new icons of Venice, just as they were becoming outmoded as an actual means of transport. The canal boats became the major subject of art, which also had a new boom in Venice. So by the end of the 19th century, major artists like Whistler and Renoir were going to Venice, and also many lesser-known painters were building up a new industry, selling mainly scenes of the city and the lagoon for foreign visitors and collectors. And this new mass tourism put new demands on the city, which the Italian government strove to meet. Water lines were laid to bring fresh water from the mainland, enabling indoor plumbing to be installed in the city's buildings for the first time. New footbridges were built over the Grand Canal, including one at the southern end and another at the northern end near the train station. And in 1881, the city launched the first vaporetto, or steam transport boat, called the Regina Margherita. And others followed, and this fleet of vaporetti came to serve as a sort of aquatic bus system, making it possible to travel around the city cheaply without hiring gondolas. And then after about 1890, as Europe entered the extravagant Belle Epoque, Italy started to capitalize on the city's newfound popularity and to make it again into a center of high culture. In 1895, the International Art Exhibition was held at Venice, which was a huge success and thereafter became a biannual event, the so-called Venice Biennale. And new higher-end visitors and collectors who went to the city, if they found the old city to be too shabby, as many of them did, they could stay instead in luxury hotels on the seashore, on the Lido. And in 1900, the Hôtel des Bains, the first large luxury hotel, opened on the Lido. It was followed soon after by the Hotel Excelsior and many others, often built in eclectic styles like Neo-Moorish or in the new modernist style of Art Nouveau. And these new resorts capitalized on the new fashion for sea bathing at the turn of the century, much like those in Atlantic City and Palm Beach in the United States, Blackpool and Brighton in England, and Cannes and Saint-Tropez in France. Yet the old city itself, even with infrastructural improvements, was still largely dilapidated and dirty, especially away from the main centers of San Marco and Rialto. And in 1902, the city suffered a further humiliation. At the beginning of July 1902, a crack appeared in the side of the Campanile of San Marco, the medieval brick bell tower across the piazza from the basilica, which was one of the city's tallest structures and a visible symbol of Venice. This fissure gradually climbed up the side of the bell tower over the course of several days, but tourists kept climbing the stairs for the views of Venice, until finally on the 13th, as the crack widened, the authorities closed the staircase and even forbade any music in the piazza for fear that the vibrations might destabilize the tower. The next morning of the 14th, a loud crack was heard, and the tower finally crumbled and collapsed to the ground, leaving behind basically just a heap of stone and brick. Fortunately, no one died, other than the custodian's cat, and some small decorative elements were salvaged, such as the gilded figure of the angel Gabriel. The city council immediately voted on that very day to rebuild the Campanile dove era com era, where it was as it was. Now this took 10 years, and the exterior of the Campanile was meticulously recreated, including with bricks fired in the medieval fashion. But the interior was redesigned with an iron substructure and an elevator. And this can be seen as the product of a complicated balancing act, as modernizing efforts were either blocked or carefully contained and hidden behind a preservationist facade. And the preservationist camp argued that historic sites and beauty were the city's greatest assets. They were able to protect landmarks like the Basilica, the Rialto Bridge, and the cityscapes of the Grand Canal from any significant change. But at the same time, modernizers argued that this asset of the city's beauty could only be harnessed with improvements to facilitate and exploit tourism. And even further, new avant-garde intellectuals condemned what they saw as a shallow, reflexive attachment to the past. So preservationists tried unsuccessfully to stop the introduction of electricity on the grounds that it would drown out the moonlight on the canals. Electricity was brought from the mainland first to the Giudecca, where it was offered to private users starting in 1886. And then the city government brought lines into the central city and began building an electric grid to replace gaslight in 1922. Some improvements for the benefit of tourists backfired and exacerbated problems in the city. Probably most importantly, many canals were partially filled in or blocked to make way for more footpaths. And this facilitated the transition from mainly boat to pedestrian transport. And it made it easier for visitors coming in by boat from the Lido or by train from the mainland to get around the city quickly and to shop. It made gondolas more outmoded, such that they became merely scenic entertainment. But most of all, it blocked off tidal currents that had kept water flowing through the canals. And if you think back to the early Middle Ages in Venice, those canals had been planned and interconnected very deliberately to keep the tidal currents moving. And so where almost the whole canal system had once been clear and clean enough to swim in, many canals now became stagnant pools and breeding grounds of bacteria. And the famous smelly Venetian canal is really a modern phenomenon. The entire canal system then became dirtier, accumulating urban runoff. And this allowed for unhealthful diseases to fester. So in the 19th century, the city saw its first disease epidemics since the last bubonic plague outbreaks had ended in the 1600s. And most of all, cholera became the new recurring plague in the city. The first outbreak of cholera in Venice was in 1835, following after the pathogen's first arrival in Europe. There were then several more in the mid-1800s, including, as I mentioned, in 1849, when the Revolutionary Republic was under siege by Austria. And these were compounded also by smallpox, measles, and typhoid. There was a respite for a while with improved sanitation and plumbing in the late 1800s. But then another catastrophic outbreak hit the city in 1911, in the midst of the new boom in high-end tourism to the Lido. And this contrast between the opulent, vibrant, and modern resorts on the Lido and the largely dilapidated old city was already glaring by this point, and then only further heightened by this disease epidemic, which seemed to symbolize the final decrepitude of old Europe. And this dramatic break was the backdrop for Thomas Mann's famous novel, Death in Venice, and it's about a German composer who goes to the Lido to take the sea air for his health, but meets and becomes unhealthily obsessed with a Polish teenage boy and follows him on his day trips into the disease-ridden old city. And this can be seen as representing Victorian Europe's sort of spiritual decay and longing for renewed youth and vigor. And the novel was written just before World War I, and it helped now to define Venice as a symbol of decadence and decline, and in retrospect of the sort of old Europe that came to be destroyed by the war. And this sort of view of Venice as the symbol of decadence and even of death still persists, with echoes in literature and film like Don't Look Now. So the modernizers were desperate to push back against this fate of Venice, which consigns them to being a sort of graveyard of Europe. And this dream of modernization was deferred, for one thing, by World War I in 1915 to 18. So during those years, the city was blockaded, again by the Austro-Hungarians. It lost all tourism and commercial shipping. It was bombarded by air in a total of 40 bombing runs by Austrian planes. This bombing was very imprecise. It mainly aimed at the Arsenale in the east and the train station in the west, but meanwhile it hit many civilian buildings, destroying precious art and architecture, including a ceiling by Tiepolo. Many other artworks, artifacts, and holy relics were packed up and shipped to the mainland for safekeeping, or wrapped in mattresses and enclosed in vaults for protection. In October 1918, Italy won a major victory against Austria at Vittorio Veneto. And at the end of the war, the city was triumphant. It became a major center of the new militant Italian nationalism, including of irredentism, the notion that Italians should get back control of Italia irredenta, or unredeemed Italy, referring to all the lands that had once been in Italian hands, including, in the view of many Venetians, including Istria and Dalmatia on the eastern coast of the Adriatic, which had long been Venetian territory. And this nationalism and irredentism could combine with a more extreme avant-garde modernism. So the modernizers, back before the war even, had included a sort of radical camp called the Futurists, led by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who had agitated for Venice to be totally rebuilt. And in 1910, Marinetti published a, quote, Manifesto contro Venezia Passatista, which called for the city to fill in the small, stinking canals with the rubble from the old, collapsing, and leprous palaces, and, quote, prepare for the birth of an industrial and militarized Venice capable of dominating the great Adriatic and Italian lake, End quote. Now, ironically, this futurist manifesto also looked back to the past, but instead of aesthetically, it looked back to the past politically, trying to revive Venice's role as a base of naval power and as a power center for a modernized Italian nation-state. Now, it happens that Marinetti and his futurist followers later embraced Italy's entry into World War I, and then after the end of the war formed a futurist party, which then soon after merged into Mussolini's fascist party. So after the war, modernists, futurists, and fascists together pushed for a total remaking and industrialization of Venice. They found that it was not worth it to try to remake the old city itself, as the extremists like Marinetti might have wanted, which the residents largely wished to preserve for its historic and aesthetic value, and which is built on marshy islands that are not very convenient terrain for modern industry. But they did harness the city into a wider project of developing the lagoon and using it as a military and industrial base. So in 1920, the Italian state began building a massive new industrial port at the town of Marghera on the northern shore of the lagoon, just above the older port city of Mestre. And huge amounts were invested into rapid development, such that by 1940, 60 large factories were operating near the harbor and wharves. In 1926, jurisdictional lines were moved such that both Marghera and Mestre were incorporated into the municipality of Venice. And the old city of Venice increasingly became a kind of bedroom community, housing workers for the ports and factories on the mainland. And this can be seen as a sort of odd echo of Venice's reorientation westward towards the terra firma that had happened back in the 1400s. A downside of this industrialization was that chemical runoff from these industries and from agricultural fertilizers further polluted the lagoon, making the waters around the city and the canals toxic. But still, at the same time that heavy industry grew on the mainland shores, the fascist state also wanted to revive and exploit Venice as a showcase for high culture. In 1927, the fascist government appointed the businessman aristocrat Count Volpi as the so-called first procurator of St. Mark's, ostensibly the overseer of historic landmarks and preservation. But the Count was a big personality. He had been an industrialist involved in bringing electrification to Venice, the colonial governor of Libya, and the finance minister of Italy. And as procurator of St. Mark's, Volpi acted as a kind of grand impresario, using the city as a site for modernist spectacle. In 1930, he took over control of the Venice Biennale, and he began expanding it, first with a festival of music, and then in 1932, he launched the Venice Film Festival, mainly held on the Lido, which seeks to elevate the new medium of film to the level of high innovative art. All of this succeeded in bringing international avant-garde attention into Venice. The Hotel Europa became a hangout for artists and intellectuals. In 1931, Harry's Bar opened nearby the Hotel Europa in St. Mark's, facing the mouth of the Grand Canal. And it was founded by an Italian entrepreneur, but it took an American-sounding name and became the spot for the international smart set to see and be seen. It attracted all kinds of celebrities, but especially filmmakers like Orson Welles, Charlie Chaplin, and Alfred Hitchcock. In 1933, the fascist government constructed a road bridge over the lagoon alongside the older rail bridge. And it went from the mainland into a large auto traffic plaza called the Piazzale Roma next to the train station in Santa Croce. And this road bridge served several functions. It could serve commuters going to work on the mainland in the new industries. It served visitors coming in by bus, especially with new tour groups. And it also served a symbolic function, as automobiles were presented as emblematic of fascist modernity. Automobiles were a major export product of both fascist Italy and Germany. In 1934, Venice's new role as a showcase for fascist modernity reached its peak, when it was used as the site for the first meeting of Hitler and Mussolini. On June 14th, Hitler landed at the Lido by plane and met there with Mussolini. He was reportedly unhappy because he was wearing civilian clothes, whereas Mussolini, without warning, showed up in military uniform. They together reviewed Italian troops, then took a motor launch across to the Old City, where they saw a concert of Wagner, and visited the Art Biennale, where they saw an elaborate German pavilion made up in the Nazi style. And this was especially important, it seems, to Hitler, who was himself a former painter and saw art as an important propaganda medium. The two dictators had a private discussion over the fate of Austria in a sort of private meeting in Padua. They reportedly argued and could not come to agreement. But nonetheless, the visit underscored for Hitler the importance of pageantry and spectacle. By this time, it seems there was relatively little opposition to fascism in Venice, especially as the city was now benefiting from so much government patronage. In 1940, Italy entered into World War II on the side of Germany. A significant number of Venetians volunteered in the Italian military, largely in order to take part in campaigns in the Balkans aimed at regaining old Venetian territories like Dalmatia and Albania. But in 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Mussolini's government soon collapsed, and the Germans therefore invaded and occupied northern Italy rather than ceding it to the Allies. The Nazis took possession of Venice in September 1943. And by and large, Venice was a relatively safe place to be in the war, even under German occupation. It didn't have very much military importance, so there was no significant fighting in the city. It was also full of historic and artistic treasures, which the Allies wanted to preserve. And for that reason, the city was not bombed. There was not a lot of resistance within the city, only a fairly small underground network. In 1944, 7 leaders of this underground partisan resistance in Venice were shot on an embankment in Castello, which was later renamed Riva dei Sette Martiri, the embankment of the 7 martyrs. So the city was generally fairly quiet with relatively little violence. The big exception was for the Jews. So Nazis did try to round up the Jews of Venice. Most fled or went into hiding, as was common throughout Italy. But 200 were captured and sent to death camps, including the chief rabbi. And of those 200, only 8 survived and returned to Venice. The de facto civic leader of the Jewish community, Giuseppe Giona, committed suicide rather than hand over lists of the Venetian Jews. In the last months of the war, in the winter of 1944 to 45, the Allies did bomb the industrial plants around Mestre and Porto Marghera, but still left Venice itself untouched. The Germans, it seems, sought to take advantage of this sort of safe harbor. They moved warships directly into the lagoon around the city to refuel and transfer materials. And so on one occasion, on March 21st, 1945, Allied pilots did bomb these German vessels and sank several of them. Just a few weeks later, Italian partisans liberated Padua, and on April 29th, Allied troops entered Venice and set up their headquarters at the Hotel Danieli with fairly little resistance. It happens that they were under the command of a New Zealander general named Bernard Freyberg, who had spent his honeymoon in Venice in 1922 and had stayed at that hotel several times. So after the end of the war, the United States emerged as the main economic and military power in the West. And there followed another even bigger flood of American tourism, facilitated by more guidebooks aimed at Americans and by stories from war veterans who had been to the city at the end of the war. And Venice again came to be associated with art, romance, and bohemianism. Ernest Hemingway went to the city, spent a lot of time at Harry's Bar, where he had his own corner table, and his book, Over the River and Into the Trees, re-romanticized the city as a place of mystery. In 1949, the American heiress and art collector Peggy Guggenheim purchased the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni in Dorsoduro at the mouth of the Grand Canal, just across from Harry's Bar, and she made it into a showroom of her avant-garde art collection. And this helped to bring back highbrow cachet and put Venice back into the center of art and modernism. In the 1950s, the city was glamorized and popularized in romantic films like Three Coins in the Fountain and Summertime, with Katharine Hepburn playing a mature American woman who goes on her own to see the city and has a fling with a handsome Italian. In one scene, Hepburn's character backs up to get a good photo of a building and falls backward into a canal. And Hepburn filmed this scene 4 times, and as a result got an eye infection, which impaired her vision for the rest of her life. So the increasingly toxic water around Venice was now a real danger. And at the same time, it was observed that a new problem was literally arising to threaten the city. So for centuries, Venice had seen occasional spells of acqua alta, or high water. So this can occur at moments when the high tide coincides with shifting sea winds and runoff from rain or snowmelt on the land. And at these times, the lagoon could rise high enough to flood more low-lying streets and piazzas. By about 1960, it was noted that these periodic floods were becoming more frequent and sometimes rising higher. But this was not enough to cause too much alarm until November 3, 1966, when an enormous storm blew up off the Adriatic, driving sea waves into the lagoon and dumping rain onto the land, all through that night and into the next day. The water level rose 6 feet above the high tide level, topped embankments, and entered the ground floors of almost every building in the city. After it receded, debris, including dead animals, furniture, and raw sewage, was everywhere. And moisture from filthy water also wicked upward into the upper floors of the buildings. So this catastrophic flood created a new sense of emergency. Rescue and repair efforts were quickly mobilized in Italy and abroad, especially in Britain. UNESCO opened an office in the city, and private action led to the foundation of permanent organizations, including in 1971 Venice in Peril, based mainly in Britain, and another based in the United States called Save Venice Incorporated. Various charities around the world associated into the Association of Private Committees for the Safeguarding of Venice. And what is more, the disaster, combined with the frequent pattern of acqua alta, created the perception that the city was sinking. And this today is still what many people first think of when they think about Venice. It's not entirely clear to what degree this is really happening, or if it is, why, or to what extent. The acqua alta may also have to do more with changing sea currents or weather patterns on sea or on land, and it is possibly also exacerbated by global rising sea levels with the melting ice caps. But measurements do suggest that in recent years, the foundations of the city have in fact been sinking very slowly, about 1 to 2 millimeters per year, which translates to, over the course of about 50 years, 7.5 centimeters, which is roughly 3 inches in American measurements. And this may not sound like a lot, but if floodwater is coming up into your house, those 3 inches might make a significant difference. And there are possible reasons for this slow sinking. One is the dredging of ship canals in the lagoon, which could lead silt under the city foundations to erode. The city was not built on bedrock. It is built simply on vertical wood pilings driven into the earth. So if that saturated earth erodes outward, it can lead to sinking. It also may be caused by the ships themselves, which create large wakes that strike and slowly weaken the embankments and foundations. And thirdly, it may be caused by the extraction of water from the water table underneath the lagoon. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. Traditionally, the city has not taken water from the water table, which is likely to be brackish anyway. And the old wells around the city were actually pumps drawing from cisterns that gathered and filtered rainwater. And even the modern-day plumbing system that's been installed channels water from the mainland. It does not draw it up from wells or taps. But modern heavy industries on the mainland shore, like in Porto Marghera, do tap into the aquifers, which releases some of the pressure and possibly leads to subsidence of the seabed under the lagoon. So there was a period of alarm following after the 1966 flood, and in 1973, the Italian government enacted a special law enabling the government to enact regulations to protect and preserve Venice. Rules were created to restrict groundwater pumping and chemical pollution, mainly enforced on the industrial plants around Marghera. But this created some controversy. Some Venetians saw the new laws and rules as hampering modernization and development that the residents of Venice needed. And they saw the law as part of a campaign to keep the city preserved in amber as a historical artifact, rather than keeping it alive as a living city. And just after this special law was passed, a Venetian art historian and journalist named Vladimiro Dorigo published a book called Una legge contro Venezia, or A Law Against Venice. And he argues that the law incorrectly blamed industry for the sinking of the city, industry which was necessary for Venice to be viable. And further, it did not address the real crises, which were the depopulation of the city, with the combination of loss of jobs and high prices of food and housing, as the city was colonized by outsiders. And similar complaints could be directed towards the preservationists more broadly, who in their view wanted to keep the city physically as it is, but did not thereby make it easier for residents to live there and make a living. So from the 70s onward, different ways were proposed of squaring the circle, of stopping the crisis of Acqua Alta while somehow keeping the city economically viable. One was to try to stop or reverse the subsidence of the city. For instance, proposals were put forward to pump water back down into the aquifer and sort of float the lagoon back up. Another was to try to stop the high water from coming in from the sea. And in the 1990s, the Italian government approved a project to build inflatable barriers in the 3 channels opening from the lagoon to the sea, which would inflate and block the channels when the water rose above a certain level. And this project was called the Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, or in short, MOSE, in a sort of indirect reference to the prophet Moses parting the seas. But objections were made to this project, that it would stop the tidal flow of the lagoon, making the waters more stagnant and dirty, that it would cut off the migration of fish and sea life, and presumably these effects might only be temporary. According to the supporters of Mose, the gates would only be closed for short periods of high water. But then the question arises, what if it would have to be more frequent as the land sinks lower or the seas rise higher? Nonetheless, the Mose project was started in 2003, and after much delay and cost overruns, as is typical in Italy, it was tested out in 2021 and started actually being used to mitigate floods in 2022. Now finally, the city's way of squaring the circle economically and hopefully of obviating the need for modern industry was by exploiting instead the city's beauty and history with more tourism. So tourism into Venice only increased in the later 20th century, ironically as the Acqua Alta crisis intensified. And you could say in a way the Acqua Alta provided another spectacle, another reason for people to talk about and be curious about Venice. And for some visitors it arguably added a sense of urgency. You better see Venice now before it's gone. So early on, the city encouraged this new increase in mass tourism. And most significantly, in 1979, the city revived the Carnevale after a 182-year hiatus and paid to put on musical and theatrical performances. At first, it was a relatively small 4-day celebration with music and theater, but it quickly took on a life of its own. In the early 80s, word of the event traveled around the world. Thousands of curious travelers began coming into the city to see and even to participate in the carnival. It expanded first to a week and then to 2 weeks. And the Carnevale offered certain economic advantages. The tourist season in Venice back in the 40s and 50s had really been limited to only the summer. But now the city became a winter destination as well. The Carnevale is in February and March. And hotels, restaurants, and pensiones began operating year-round. But soon the event started to get out of hand. The train station, the Piazza San Marco, and the Basilica became mobbed with visitors, noisy and covered in litter. The city started to take measures like banning takeaway food to control the litter and pollution. And in 1988, they canceled the Carnevale entirely. There was no longer any state-supported event. But they couldn't stop the hundreds of thousands of visitors from coming anyway. And the event has simply continued to mushroom. In the 1990s, over 500,000 came for each carnival, and by 2010, over 1 million. And the city has become famous once again for the masked revelers in those traditional Venetian masks and costumes. But these are almost all foreign visitors and performers, not Venetians. Venetian residents themselves tend to stay away in the outer sestieri of the city or to leave the city entirely to escape the mobs of the Carnevale. And now hundreds of thousands of tourists are in the city year-round, many coming in only for the day by train or bus, and sometimes spending fairly little money. Hence, the city was seen to gain relatively little economic benefit in proportion to the strain, noise, and litter of the mass tourism. And these short-term day visitors are sometimes called hit and run, and often they constitute around 3/4 of all the visitors to the city, but bring in only 18% of the tourism revenue. So the city has tried to find ways to keep more of these visitors in Venice, at least overnight. In 2001, they loosened restrictions on hospitality in private homes and bed and breakfasts, allowing more visitors to stay overnight and allowing more residents to gain some income from the tourism. They also sought ways to house more of these people without completely overtaking the city. And cruise ships seemed to provide one answer, and the city did complete and open a cruise ship terminal in Santa Croce, next to the old industrial ship terminal, in 1997. And thereafter, large cruise ships became a common sight in the lagoon. But cruise passengers also often are just hit and run, venturing into the city only briefly before going on to other sites around Europe. And after 2000, the mass tourism more and more was seen as just too much. Millions of people were visiting the city every year, even as the resident population declined. So birth rates in Venice are low, like in all of Italy, and housing is also very expensive, with foreigners buying up even small flats in San Marco for millions of dollars. In 2009, some residents staged a mock funeral carrying a symbolic casket to mark that Venice's population had dipped below 60,000 and hence, in their view, was no longer really a city. And it is remarkable that now on almost any given day, there are more short-term visitors in Venice than there are residents. And this can give the sense, at least in San Marco and the Rialto, that you are more in a museum or an amusement park than a real city, much less one that used to be a commercial and imperial metropolis. In the 2010s, policy and political debate began to turn, with an increasing sense that tourism had passed a point of diminishing returns, and new policies were proposed, such as the banning of cruise ships, which were seen to contribute to overcrowding and also to present a possible threat of erosion or accidents and damage to the city. And this fear intensified, especially after the Costa Concordia disaster, where another cruise ship ran aground near Sardinia. In 2019, a 13-deck cruise ship did run into a wharf in Venice, injuring 5 people. And so large cruise ships of over 25,000 tons were finally banned from the city in 2021, just 24 years after the cruise ship terminal had opened. But this was a controversial move, and it came after the pandemic, which had hit many tourist-based businesses in the city hard. And some, especially small business people, felt that they needed these large ships to come back to revitalize the industry. So some exceptions are still made to this day, with some large ships allowed into the lagoon and to dock at the port in Santa Croce, while meanwhile the government, supposedly at least, works on adapting industrial ports in Marghera, Mestre, and Chioggia to handle the passenger ships instead. So you can see here a continuing difficult balancing act between preservation and modernization, and between protection and profit, and recurring hopes to somehow square the circle, some way for Venice to have its cake and eat it too. And this was a particularly difficult dilemma to resolve in the case of the final incident that I will talk about, which arguably encapsulates the dilemma of modern-day Venice. So in 1995, the Grand La Fenice Opera House was closed for renovations. And by this time, La Fenice was, I think you could say, the real ceremonial heart of the city, more so than San Marco, which was basically given over to tourists. It's the only place where the city of Venice can go, not just to see opera, but to see itself, as reflected in the inward-looking design, with boxes facing each other more than the stage. And some old-time Venetians who grew up earlier in the 20th century have noted how in winter it was cheaper to heat a theater box than a palazzo, and many families spent much of their time here in the opera house like a second home, occasionally opening the curtains in order to see and be seen. But by the 1990s, the Opera House had more than 100 years of wear and tear since it had last been renovated in the 1800s, and it was closed to be extensively overhauled. As of the beginning of 1996, the Opera House was still closed but was scheduled to reopen in a matter of weeks in February or March. But on the night of January 29th, a fire broke out. Emergency fireboats could not douse the building since the city had no modern fire hydrants and water had to be drawn from the canals, but the two nearest canals to the Opera House were both drained at that time for dredging. Within half an hour, the ceilings and galleries collapsed, followed then by the roof of the building a couple of hours later, which fell, spraying sparks all over the area. Fortunately, at least it was a calm and damp night, otherwise the fire may have spread and destroyed an entire quarter of the city. Nonetheless, the fire in the Opera House burned on all night long as the mayor watched weeping, completely gutting the building and leaving only the facade intact. The elaborate 18th and 19th century interior, with sculptures, frescoes, and rare furniture and Murano glass lamps and chandeliers, were destroyed, along with musical instruments, costumes, and manuscripts. It was highly unusual for a fire to break out during a time of disuse. No one is in there smoking or setting up lamps or lighting. And investigators eventually concluded that two contractors had set the fire intentionally in order to cover up the fact that they were disastrously behind schedule in the renovations. Several others were later arrested, convicted, and given prison sentences. And the city had to decide what to do. But they quickly resolved to rebuild, again, com era dove era, as it was, where it was. And money was raised rapidly. For example, the Repubblica newspaper raised $1 million in less than 4 days, and various civic groups in the city donated hundreds of thousands directly to the mayor, including among them the city's prostitutes. But now craftsmen, laborers, art historians, and architects, including those who had mastered acoustics, all had to be marshaled to somehow recreate this unique building. And they had to do so without surviving exact designs. Fortunately, there was by now an extensive preservation and restoration network, based both in Italy and abroad, to organize and support the project. There were also photographs of the Opera House from the 1950s and 60s to work from, and measurements had been taken to document and preserve the acoustics of the house just months before the renovation began in 1995. So the rebuilding project went on for 7 years, and builders recreated the form and furnishings of the house using seasoned larch wood from the same forests that had supplied the original wood. Fresco painters recreated the elaborate blue ceiling with figures of the three graces and personifications of music and dance. Sculptors and mask makers refashioned the elaborate gilded Rococo scrollwork surrounding the ceiling and the supporting brackets carved in the forms of mermaids. And as with the Campanile of San Marco, the appearance was recreated as precisely as possible. But behind the scenes, the structure was adjusted and modernized to provide more rehearsal area and to allow the installation of more modern stage equipment and lighting. The Opera House reopened in December 2003 with a concert series with works by Wagner, Stravinsky, and Beethoven. Some reviewers said that it was a successful recreation, if the colors were maybe a bit too bright. But others objected, such as the reviewer in La Repubblica, who called the recreated opera house, quote, kitsch, a fake imitation of the past, and argued, quote, the city should have had the nerve to build a completely new theater. Venice betrayed its innovative past by ignoring it, end quote. And this illustrates again the dilemma of preservation versus dynamism, and also, I think, a deeper paradox that nearly all historic masterpieces were once innovative and groundbreaking in their time, and hence it is impossible to both recreate the monuments of the past as they were, and at the same time recreate the dynamism and innovation that gave rise to them in the first place. And this is perhaps an irresolvable dilemma, but one that, in a way, defines the whole city of Venice. Is Venice a city or a museum? And can it somehow be both? But regardless of that unresolved paradox, the concert series at the reopening in December 2003 began with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which famously features the Ode to Joy, the great celebration of art and creation. And then the following year, in 2004, the first operatic production to be staged in the newly rebuilt theater was, of course, La Traviata.
Viviamo nei lieti calici che la bellezza infiora e la fuggevol ora s'inebria volutta.
So thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and thank you especially to my patrons who make this podcast possible. It's a huge honor just to be paid at all for doing something like this that I enjoy, let alone being able to make a living off of it, which is the point I'm at now. Since I posted my 2024 year in review a couple of weeks ago, a number of patrons, more than I could keep track of, increased their pledges, which I appreciate enormously, and several others have signed up over the past few weeks, so that's tremendously heartening, and it should make it possible for me to keep producing these lectures while also working on other projects that I've put off, like a book proposal, finally. And as I said in December, I want to thank my patrons now by name, according to the month of the year in which they originally signed up. And since we're about to begin the month of February, I'd like to thank now all of my current active patrons who first signed up in the month of February: Sam, David J.J. Newsom, Monroe Labuis, William Finn, Joshua Maravellas, Mike Sheketoff, Thaddeus Pera, Anna S., Isaac, Jim Howell, Deborah Bazis, Aaron Smith, John Parcell, Keith L. Simmons, Jesse Barber, Aaron Yergemeyer, and Taz Sibley. Thank you.